Welcome everybody to Off Time. Oh dear, it's been a way too long since we've done one of these. Normally they're pre-recorded, so we record a bunch of people shooting the shit on a conversation, and we cut out the most boring pieces, and you got 15 or 20 minutes of an hour conversation or 2-hour conversation. A little different tonight. And this was actually by 𝐓𝐢𝐿𝐷's request, and I think he was onto something there, some stuff that he wanted to talk about, and he and I have been talking about it. I'm like, hey, we normally shoot the shit anyway for a couple hours on the phone. Let's just do it live. So that's what we're doing. I thought we had some great shit to talk about. A couple of for those of you who've never seen Off Time, and it's been a while, couple of quick things about the format and what we're doing. A lot more informal. We've invited 𝗦𝗍𝐺 here too, because I think this is the kind of conversation he'd like to be a part of. I know I'd like to have him around for this. So, 𝗓𝗍 and I are going to shoot the shit. But I'm a verbal processor, and what that really means is I love the line from Hawthorne. How do I know what I mean to say until I see what I've written? So I see what I write, and it's like when I teach writing, that's the hardest thing to explain to writers, that they don't usually know what they want to say, and usually that's why a first draft, you throw in everything but the kitchen sink, and then you take a look at everything, and then you can see what you really mean and what you didn't, and that's how I think. So I have to talk and I have to say shit, and I say shit and I workshop shit by saying it. When I say something, I was like, oh, that's a bad, no, I didn't really mean that one, and I sort of thought everybody did this, and it turns out not a lot of other people, but my friends in suffering 𝗓𝐢𝐿𝐷 is. But the reason I'm saying all this is just before we start, just sort of a reminder to a lot of, that's it. We're going to be shooting the shit. We're going to be trying to process ideas, and, I think we expect on Off Time, we expect that there's going to be a lot of hot takes, and some of them may end up being really bad. So we'll see. I don't think we're not doing this show because anybody here that's talking is an expert on anything. We try to find you good experts and people who know what they're talking about and practiced opinions on In Time. This is Off Time. This is something else. Having said that, I fully endorse giving 𝗓𝐢𝐿𝐷 a hard time about anything that he says. But it is welcome, 𝗓𝐢𝐿𝐷. How you doing?
That's a good way to inspire open and honest searching for the right answers.
Okay, fair. So we'll start out with a criticism of me that even joking about it, it's like, yeah, it's because we just have a whole audience that's just sitting there with a pen and paper ready, like, let's just wait for 𝗓𝐢𝐿𝐷 to say something. So,
somebody that I was watching on YouTube made the comment, and I think we even covered that interview at one point on one of our shows, where it says, he said that in order to think, you have to risk being offensive. So
yes.
How do you know? How do you work through? I don't know how other people do it. I am a verbal processor as well. I like to work things through. I like to try and teach other people what I've learned. It helps me learn more about it, make sure that I actually have a good understanding of it, especially if somebody already kind of knows something about it. Because if I make a mistake, they can correct me. And when I'm going through different arguments, I will try arguments from both sides of an issue, especially if I'm not strongly in a position. And I'll try and work through all of the arguments that I know of and see which ones hold together, which ones are most compelling, and which ones don't. So sometimes I will be talking to somebody and they're like, I can't believe that you hold this position. How could you hold this position? I thought better of you. And it's like, I don't necessarily hold this position. These are the arguments I'm trying to make to see if this position holds any water at all. So, it's kind of my process, and I'm struggling with one right now.
Well, I think you had said this before too, and I think 𝗓𝐿𝐷 had said this, which I was watching a Holy 𝗓𝐿𝐷 streaming, and she had said at one point that, she thought it was awfully unfair that when you're having a discussion, there's this sort of idea that if somebody else makes it actually a really good point to which you have no counter, and you see that it's a really good point, that means you should change your mind right then and there. And it's sort of like, no, you got to, realistically speaking, you got to spend some time processing. And we all hold positions that we don't actually have the answer to or the defense of right here and now, and that's not unfair. It is not unreasonable for that. Now, again, I mean, we're doing in time. We're a little more strict about that kind of thing. It's like, no, you came here to talk, so let's. But here was but yeah. So you've been struggling. So tell me. It's just you and me now, is Andrew. So tell me what it is. What you've been struggling with.
Kind of like as the title says, it's like there's certain kinds of principles, fundamental principles that I think are important and that they should be followed, and that following those in and of themselves is a good idea. Not just that they're good ideas; they have to be that too, obviously. And sometimes what happens if for some reason that you end up straying from them for some reason, or trying to get back to some fundamentals, and you realize that, consequences are real, and, something could be done wrong for, say, 10 years, and you realize, hey, this has been done wrong, and we need to fix this, so let's fix it. And there's always unintended consequences. Some of them are foreseeable, some of them aren't. I mean, there were a lot of people who were harmed, innocent people who were harmed by the abolition of slavery. Obviously, the point that there was far more people being abused than were being harmed by it. But the fact still remains that there were, children of these large plantation owners. They suffered, losing their slaves. That, and it kicked us into an entire war. So, but it's like we should still get to the fundamental principle that, owning other people's property is not moral. So I look at kind of sort of, I'm still very conservative when it comes to the role of government. Well, this mostly kind of revolves around what's going on politically in our government stuff. Some of the decisions the Supreme Court's coming out with, and then going, well, I actually agree with the reasoning behind this. A lot of the decisions they're making. Like, okay, that makes sense according to our Constitution, and I am a fairly literalist and originalist when it comes to our Constitution. It means what it means when it was written, and that's how you should view all laws, because word uses change over time, and the intent of the law shouldn't change. So, yeah. But when you look at it, it's like, okay, well, so maybe something's been done wrong, and maybe something was done for good reason, but the fundamentals propping that reason up were bad. So it's like great outcome, bad reasoning. And it's like, so we want to kind of get away with that, so we have good reasons for the laws that we have, because I think we should have very good reasons for the laws that we have. And if there aren't any good reasons for the law, get rid of it. So the problem with that is that that's a process, and it's a process where people can get hurt. Yeah. This was mostly really come to light with the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Most of the scholars I've ever listened to discussing that Supreme Court decision have all agreed that the fundamental reasoning for their decision was flawed, that it wasn't well thought out, wasn't well justified decision.
Yes.
But they also all agreed that the outcome was good and that they didn't think that it should be overturned for that reason. And then I'm sitting here in abstract thinking that Roe versus Wade is never going to be overturned, going, well, no, it actually should be overturned, and then they should bring the case and decide it properly with reasoning.
With the okay, you cut out there for a sec, but yeah, so that it should. So just to frame this really quickly. So if I understand what you're saying, this is the like sort of formal logic way to put this is, okay, I could sit here and say Boston is in Russia. Russia is in the United States. Therefore, Boston is in the United States. Well, my conclusion is actually true. My conclusion is right, but the argument has some faults in it. But that doesn't actually mean that the conclusion was wrong. The conclusion was actually true, but it was argued poorly. So you can sit there and attack an argument and say that's a bad argument. You're reasoning badly, but still agree with the conclusion. So whenever somebody makes a claim, you can either attack the conclusion, or you can attack the reasoning, or you can attack both if you'd like. But so what you're saying is what happens when you may agree with the conclusion, but you don't agree with how we got there? Is that what you're saying with Roe v. Wade? So you're pro-choice, but you didn't. You agreed with the general consensus, and I agree with you that was the general consensus, that privacy was not what grants the right to choice. We do have the right to choice, but it's not done through privacy, which is how Roe v. Wade did it. So is that roughly it?
Yeah. And,
okay.
and I kind of bring this example up because this really kind of brought this idea a lot more to the fore. Because I've looked back through and said, look, like the 17th Amendment was atrocious. It was one of the worst amendments we had. Forgive me, I might have gotten the amendment wrong. It is the amendments that made senators directly elected by popular vote instead of appointed by state legislatures. Because that took away the entire purpose of the Senate. It's like, well, then you just have another House of Representatives, only now the representatives are apportioned, aren't apportioned evenly between the states. Originally the states themselves were supposed to have a voice in the government, and since no one state was supposed to be more or less important than another, all states got 2 senators. Their legislatures appointed their senators to go to and represent the state's interests, not necessarily the citizens, but the state's interests in the federal government. So you had the representatives of the people, the citizens of the United States. You had representatives of the states as state entities. And, that was the purpose of the 2 houses. So I've never liked that. It's like we should repeal that.
And the states
amendment.
are equal. The states are equal in the Senate. There was a deliberate reason for that. So the population actually doesn't matter. The Senate doesn't represent the population. So, okay, that makes sense. Correct. That makes sense. I get that. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, and I'm just going to kind of go through a couple of my more conservative beliefs about government and fiscal policy and things like that. I brought up Roe versus Wade because that it brought to light something that I think I had underappreciated and kind of dismissed because it didn't seem like it would really happen. But now that I'm seeing some things actually happen, like the abuse of the Commerce Clause, the abuse of the General Welfare Clause, the federal government has taken on far more responsibility and powers onto itself than was ever intended by the Constitution, by the framers of the Constitution. And there were no amendments passed to grant the federal government this kind of authority. They've been twisting words and say, well, word usage has changed now. We've changed, at least in the usage in regards to government. We have changed the usage of regulate. It doesn't mean today what it meant back in the late 1700s. So there's a lot of different things where I'm like, this needs to go back because we need to have the fundamental rule of law. And it's like the very fundamental top pillar law of the land is the Constitution. And I see that somebody taking a pickaxe, the Constitution, just slowly chipping away that base every time that the government does something that it's not supposed to or intended to have done. And of course, the responsibility was incumbent upon, the states, which largely gave up all of their power to the federal government because they didn't have to have the accompanying responsibility. So, they gave it up to the federal government. It's like, you be responsible for that stuff. It's much easier.
Yeah.
And so there's been a slow shift over time towards federal authority versus state authority. And I'm like, but you're doing this the wrong way. It's like, I think the Second Amendment should have been amended. I know I've said that before. It absolutely should have been amended. Instead of doing that, they passed the National Firearms Act. They decided to pass a piece of legislation, and the population and the states let it slide. So, it wasn't challenged enough. And now, you've passed all these other laws that aren't being challenged. It's like you can't sell a gallon of raw milk to your neighbor, or the freaking EPA's, or not the EPA, the FDA is going to come after you if they find out about it. And I mean, it's gotten pretty oppressive, and it's like, we need to get back to the fundamental rule of law and doing things the way that they're supposed to be done. Actually passing constitutional amendments where needed if you want to grant the government the authority to do these things. And I think that there are several things that the federal government should have the authority to do. Dealing with pandemics is a good example.
And let me just bounce off of that real quick, because I want to say too, which is when you and I did our gun debate, which was, I still think, one of the best, and certainly for me informed my understanding of the Second Amendment a great deal, talking to you about that. But one of the things that you had pointed out was a lot of times you would make an argument like, that's not what the Second Amendment says. And I'd be like, yeah, but it's wrong. And you'd actually agree with me. And you'd sit there and say, yeah, no, the Second Amendment clearly cannot handle like nuclear arms and all these other things. It must be changed. And for me, it took me a while to figure out how you could square that circle, because I was sitting there going, okay, you agree with me that the Second Amendment as cannot today mean you have the right to bear any arms you want. You agree with that, but you're sitting here saying we can't legislate it. And the way you square that circle is you say, well, yeah, it's supposed to be amended. That's why the Constitution can be changed. So you're actually for a lot of the common sense laws that I would be for. You're just for that being amended the quote correct way, because the Congress wasn't actually given the authority to do that. So when you sit there and you sound like a Second Amendment absolutist, you sound like one when people are talking to you, when I'm talking to you, because like, this is what it says. But it's not that you're a Second Amendment absolutist because you would like to see it changed. You actually do think there needs to be restrictions. You just think it should be done the way the Constitution says to restrict those kinds of things, not ad hoc. Anyway, just to frame that. So yeah.
Like I said, the chipping away at the authority of the Constitution is essentially what it is. It's a moral hazard. And I've pointed out that the government has become one gigantic moral hazard. Its entire fiscal policy is a moral hazard. It's like we shouldn't be doing these things. And, if there's something that is being done that you want to change, like, well, then you need to pass an amendment. It's like we had a global pandemic, and it's like, okay, well, the Constitution is very clear about immigration policy. So coming into this country, they have carte blanche to do pretty much whatever they'd like as far as health-related reasons. If they want to require all people coming into the United States to be vaccinated, but they have no authority granted by the Constitution to regulate or to have any say whatsoever about public health amongst all of the states. That's a state power. And we saw what happens. I mean, we're still seeing the effects of that, where you have 50 patchwork rules about a global pandemic. And it's like geographic borders doesn't change the cause and effects of pandemics or the consequences of them. There's an area, I absolutely agree. It's like I've always maintained that the federal government was ultimately put there, and its intended purpose was to deal with things that you either didn't want a state to do by itself, such as regulate commerce between states, or things that it can't do on its own, like national defense. One state can't defend the whole country. So, those are the two primary purposes of the federal authority. For everything else, let the states figure it out. And you'll have a shuffling of population where ideologies will run rampant. There's some risk in that. Freedom isn't risk free. Yeah. So it can actually be a little dangerous to have freedom because it requires an accompanying responsibility with it. And people love to, shout about rights, and they conveniently forget that there's responsibilities attached to all of those rights. But so, yeah, I just look at all these things and it's like, we need to, it came to a head because the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. And then I started looking at what some of these unintended consequences could be, and what some of the foreseeable and unforeseeable, you can't really pick unforeseeable consequences. Just
I started looking at I like that. I started looking at the unforeseeable consequences, and man, I wish I could tell you, but
I was confused. So I'm going, yes, I agree with overturning Roe versus Wade. And then I'm like, and now there are going to be people who suffer for this. And now I'm getting stuck with, well, the fundamental principles matter if we want to keep an actual republic going here. They really do matter. If you keep doing this and keep chipping away at this, eventually you're not going to have a constitutional republic anymore. It will collapse. And, it's happened throughout all of history. That's how republics collapse. So that if it doesn't just suddenly get a popular upswell like in France and just decide they're going to overthrow the government, or like we did to the British. So it's like, it's important. This is really important. But these things have consequences, and those consequences matter. So how do you square the consequences versus the fundamental long term. This is really important, and we need to abide by this, and we need to fix these things to make sure that they're done correctly and are on a good, solid legal and principled foundation, reasoned foundation. And yet, if you try and do that, because we've allowed ourselves to slip for so long in so many different areas, that there's going to be a lot of consequences and people are going to get hurt. And I don't want that for people. I don't want people to get hurt. So it's really difficult for me to go, I don't know what to do now, because I think both are important.
So let's frame this so that we understand, I think, sort of where you stand in terms of the ideology. So what you are pro-choice, but Roe v. Wade, in your view, was while you agree with the conclusion, which was that a woman must have a right to choose, you disagree with how it was reasoned. And that's actually really important, because all future laws are based on past precedent. So if it was argued incorrectly, if it was argued poorly, that poor arguing can have a lot of really bad consequences down the line, as people say, well, Roe was decided this way. Yeah, well, even though the conclusion in Roe may have been correct, that reasoning wasn't. So you see tremendous harm in allowing laws that might be good laws or good precedents to continue if they had been reasoned poorly. And because of the way our system works, that's a very valid concern. But the flip side, the only way that the Constitution that I'm aware of, unless you can think of something else, would allow for something like Roe v. Wade would be a constitutional amendment. And you know, as well as I do, that isn't going to happen. There's no way, at least right now, in terms of how this is structured, for we can't pass a constitutional amendment even to say that, the ERA, okay, which is a lot less contentious than this. So if you really are pro-choice, you've got a problem, because the way the current political environment is, there's no way to pass to guarantee a woman's right to choose. There's no way to do that, or to really guarantee bodily autonomy, which is, I think, what your biggest concern is. It's bodily autonomy. It's not that a woman has a right to choose. A woman has a right to her own body, which implies that right to choose. So it's even a bigger right. It's the right to bodily autonomy. And you believe in that, but there's no way to get that passed correctly in keeping with the Constitution in the current environment. Is that a good summation of, so you've got your ideals of, and you are correct, if we keep chipping away at the Constitution, if we keep saying what it says doesn't really matter, we're not going to have law anymore. But on the flip side, how else are we going to pass? Is that roughly the conundrum you are now in?
Yeah. And like I said, this really brought this to the forefront of my thinking, because it's now a reality that we're all facing. And at the same time, I'm like, I agree with the outcome, and then everybody's like, well, we should have just left it alone. And I'm like, yeah, but eventually, at some point, somebody may come up with the idea that, hey, we should get back to strictly what the Constitution says, and if you don't have this power, then you don't get this power, and we're going to have to overturn these things. And then you start seeing dominoes fall, because just like you said, precedent is built on these things, and the longer that these laws are allowed to stay, ironically, the more likely they are to stay, but the more things are built off of this flawed foundation. And so if you knock out that foundation, you're now threatening a huge swath of things, and we're seeing that in real time right now. Well, the reasoning behind Roe was used in many other decisions as well, and now those decisions are potentially under threat as well. And I'm like, this is exactly why you don't allow this in the first place. And, because now we're stuck in a no-win situation.
Well, now this is where... I can't wait for 𝗏𝗏𝗆 to come in, because this is where 𝗏𝗏𝗆 talks about us as messy human beings. And when he first talked to me about this, I'm sitting there going like, okay, we're dealing on some level with original sin, right? Which is that there's plenty of original sin already in the Constitution, which is one of the things, it's like, so, we have to deal with a messy document and people who valued things very differently than we do now, at least some things. And so how do you keep the ideals that you really kind of have to have? I think you've got a very good point here, and I think this is one that I sometimes dismiss, and the liberals, I think, sometimes, which is you do actually have to have a constitution and a document that you're going to agree you're going to follow. And while I think there is interpretation in that, and I think reasonable people can disagree on that, you still do have to try to stick with it. And you really convinced me. I feel the same way you do when it comes to Obamacare. I think Obamacare is a great idea. I think it should be done. There are definitely drawbacks. I agree, but the positives outweigh the negatives. I think every American should have health care. The Interstate Commerce Clause is not the way to do it. It was an end runner on the system, and it's one of the things, too, because when we talk about how pissed off Republicans have been and how pissed off conservatives have been and why it's not just that liberals passed health care. It's also how we did it, because we very clearly did an end run around the system. So it's sort of like we sat there and said, hey, we not only got you something you didn't like, but we did it the wrong way. It's just sort of like, ooh, a double fuck you. So I started to get that. And of course that led, this whole thing turns into a Gordian knot in the way that, like, holy smoke, because I was arguing with a conservative and they're like, well, hey, liberals, this that's happening now, which is unprecedented and, in my view, very dangerous, what's happening with SCOTUS, because even if it was all wrong, you don't roll back 50 to 100 years in a week. You don't do that, and even Roberts doesn't think you do that. But nonetheless, that's what's happening. And the response I've gotten from conservatives is, this is what you get. And I understand that. This is what you get for ignoring them for so long. And okay, I think it's a very defensible position. I have some pushback, but for them, it's a defensible position. But the corollary to that is, okay, liberals are people too. What do you think's going to happen when you undermine or when you obliterate 100 to or 50 to 150 years of progressive legislation or progressive judgments? What do you think's going to happen? So we have to be a little careful with this is what you get, because that may be true, but oh dear Lord, it's so
there's consequences, and those consequences matter. And this is why I'm like, you shouldn't stray from these fundamentals. And I see this, and I see it on both the right and the left, though the left has mostly been winning in this, at least more recently, over the past more recent history.
Yep.
And it's like, well, this is a good thing to do, and so we're going to do it however we want. And it's like, no, you need to follow the process. Yeah, but look at the gridlock that we have in Congress. We're never going to get this passed to allow the federal government to create a single-payer healthcare system to guarantee healthcare for all. That's never going to happen. And it's like, and the reason it's not going to happen is because you don't have enough support, and you can't, from the general population. Because trust me, if 90% of the population agreed with you, it would get done.
That's
if it was an important issue, it would be.
No, that's true.
And it's like, you don't have enough people who care enough about your position to get the kind of support to force this amendment. Because remember, the states can force an amendment as well, a convention of states. Interestingly, little side note, at the risk of being derailed by a shiny object,
here we go.
The general support for a convention of states is going up. And even among Democrats, it's now at 52% of Democrats are favorable or have a favorable opinion of calling a convention of states to amend the Constitution. So you don't have to rely on Congress for amendments. You can get the states together and call a convention of states to amend the Constitution, and you can do it that way. You can force Congress into it. But that's an interesting rabbit hole off to the side. That was something that had come out recently about a convention of states, polling about a convention of states. So yeah, it's like, but you have a hard time accepting that not enough people agree with you. You're like, but I'm right. This should be a right. This is thing, and it's like, instead of doing the right thing, at least from a principled point of view, you're going, no, we need this at any cost, and the cost may be eventually, probably not right at that moment, although you never know which straw actually is going to break that camel's back. But it's like, we're going to do this at the risk of chipping a little bit more at that base. And it's like the fact of the matter is the way you do it correctly is you need to change the minds of the people, get them interested enough, care enough about this topic. And sometimes you're just not going to do it. And at that point, you just have to accept that not enough people agree with you. And then you need to focus on your state, get your state to do it. Because that's another good way of getting support for like a constitutional amendment to allow something. Demonstrate its success in a state. Because it's a hell of a lot easier, and states have a far more broad authority to do things than the federal government does. But again, this is everybody across the board has kind of devolved into this. We need to have the federal government do it because it's not okay that just here in New York we're allowing abortions because them evil people in Alabama, they're not allowing abortions, and I can't be okay with that. Like, it's not affecting you in any way. But you just can't abide the fact that the people in Alabama now can't get abortions on demand, and that bugs you. And so everybody goes after that federal authority to force their viewpoint on everybody in the world, everybody in the country. So it's like that. That's not how our system was set up. And our system was specifically set up to have a high bar. And maybe we need to have a discussion about changing the requirements to amend the Constitution, because you may have a point with the willingness of political parties to engage in brinksmanship and the intransigency of the different fundamental bases to try and stop these kinds of things and entrench special interests. You may have a point there, and that may be a discussion that we need to go over. But you need to do it the correct way. And if you run around it, you run the risk of it coming apart later and causing more problems. And then I still recognize that there's huge problems, and how do you fix them? Because all of these things, everything you do has consequences, and a lot of those consequences can be negative. So it really makes me go, I don't know what to do at this point. I mean, we've gotten to the point I'm not sure that it can be fixed. And even if we can somehow fix it, let's assume we don't incite a popular uprising or a civil war. Mm-hmm. By rapidly going back to actually adhering to the Constitution, greatly restraining the federal government's power, forcing people into that suffering position, because at this point I think that's probably what's required. You're going to need to force people to feel the pain of these bad decisions or these bad policies, or at least bad reasoning behind these policies, to make them care enough to push for constitutional amendments to do this correctly. Maybe that's the case. I don't know. And if it is, it's a sucky case because people are going to get hurt.
Well, yeah, and I don't think we'd survive it, because if that's really the case, if that's what it would take, I think you would see a revolution. I don't think you'd see, because it would be such a rolling back and an undoing of everything, and for the foreseeable future. So I think the only argument that I see in the direction that you're going is if we did that, and if we were able to enforce that, which I don't think we could, but if we could, and if we could enforce people to stay on that, because you made a great point too, which is, let's assume we did that. Let's assume we went all the way back to the original way that the Constitution was written and was supposed to be followed out. We know what's going to happen 200 years from now. We know, because we tried that experiment and we ended up here. So
we know where this road goes.
Yeah. So there's that problem too, and so even if you could guarantee that we could stick on that path, if you put us all the way back to the beginning and stick on that path, the problem is the way that the system is right now. I don't think you could pass the needed legislation for some of the reasons we've discussed, and a whole bunch more, and it would take so long for us to be able to get back the rights that we have now, or the rights that we had a few months ago, but to have that done the right way in that framework, that I don't think we wouldn't devolve into chaos, violence, and all those other things in that time. And it may be that eventually we'd get back to where we could pass amendments easily. But right now, and for this foreseeable future, I don't see any functioning where we can pass, where we can actually do it the way it was intended. I think we've unraveled so much of that by now. You certainly don't unravel. You don't unwind that spring in anything in a tenth of the time that it took to unwind it, if you understand what I'm saying. So I don't think, and so that whole time we're going backwards.
Yeah, it took us 200 years to get to this point. And it's unrealistic to believe that you could survive trying to unwind all of the abuses and special interests in the matter of 4 to 8 years without causing a catastrophic collapse. But this again gets at the root of the problem, that this tipping away, this end run around, let's just get results. We don't, the ends justify the means. That's how you lose republics. That's how they collapse. That's what essentially happened to Rome. This is what's going to happen to us if we don't do that. But at the same time, we've allowed ourselves to get to a point where we can't unwind all of this realistically in any kind of time frame that it would need to be done. So it's like I'm kind of pessimistic about the survival of the republic. I am beginning to lean more into the camp that the United States is going to end up breaking up into 4 or 5 regional countries, that the Union is going to end up splitting, because we did not fundamentally adhere and agree to follow the same founding fundamental document. We didn't agree that if we were going to change this document, change the way things were done, that we would do it by a prescribed method that we all agreed to. And I don't know how you get back to that, because you're going to cause so much devastation and suffering along the way. There's going to be so many consequences trying to get back to that fundamental value of, this is our compact between all of us. These are the ascribed methods that we will pursue and use. And if we cannot succeed upon these methods, then the proposition doesn't succeed. End of story.
Well, human beings we're like water. We're like water that way too. We always find the cracks, right? I mean, that's what happened. It took us, 200 years, but we've reached the point where we've found ways around that system to be able to do it the way we want, which I think was in part what the Constitutional was trying to avoid. But we're always doing brinksmanship on some, the right, the left. We're always we do it very differently, and I think it's very hard. It's taken me a little while to see how the left is in fact doing it, but it's clearly, the left is guilty of this. So you've got now everybody trying to feel their own agenda is so much more important than everybody else's, that it's okay to break the rules because the ends justify the means. And the one problem is there are, in fact, times when the ends do justify the means. I don't like to admit that, because every time you admit that, it makes it easier to break it, because we always have this natural incentive to think now's that time, right? Because it's what I want. And it's like the times that I've found that that's actually true in my life, a handful, like I could count on one hand. It does happen. But it's so very rare. But all of us think we see it all the time, and we think it's okay to break the rules all the time. And this actually gets into this gets into everything. I mean, but you've seen. I argue atheists and anti-theists, and I make all of these arguments. And a number of times I'll see somebody saying, "Well, I know that this is how we're supposed to process a certain amount of information. This is how we do reasoning, but." I think I'm going to make an exception here and now. And I was just like, you've lost. And it's always, I'm thinking about this because there's just a couple of recent examples I've been streaming a lot on, but I don't know how you solve that problem. I do know that the nature of the universe has changed. So this country was always going to undergo some change. I guess the question was, how stable could we make it, and for how long? But I think you're right. I'm becoming pessimistic for that reason. I did have a question, because you said something now a couple of times that got me thinking about this. It is kind of a profoundly, deeply, and personal question. So feel free to just and you may not have thought of this, and you may not have an answer, or maybe you do. But the way you had phrased the thing about the Roe v. Wade, it sounded to me like what you were saying actually was, or at least what you felt or believed, was that you've always argued that Roe v. Wade should be overturned, but one of the reasons that you argued it was because you are pro-choice. So you wanted it overturned on these other grounds, but you were actually safe to make that argument, right? Because there were no consequences for you making that argument because Roe v. Wade was always safe. And then as soon as it got overturned, you realized, oh,
that's why
I've been, so my question,
why this has jumped up and slapped me in the face.
So my question was, it felt like you had a twang of guilt over having made those arguments, and I'm not saying you should. I'm not saying it would, but that's kind of like what I heard because the way you were saying it, you were like it made it sound like you wouldn't have made those arguments if you had realized that Roe v. Wade would really be overturned.
I think I would have spent more time thinking about the arguments. I have done so now. Because you're right, if I'm not entirely sure I would call what I feel guilt, but if it is, it's insofar as my dismissal of the consequences of actually overturning it. Not giving very much thought to that. Going, no, but my Constitution and my processes, laid out in the Constitution trump any other concern that you may have. And I was safe to make that, just like you said, I was safe to make those assertions because I didn't have any realistic expectation that it actually would be. So I could make that principled argument all the time because I didn't have to bear any of the consequences of the actual fulfillment of said argument. Well, this is what has brought this kind of struggle that I'm having right now about, is because now it's like, okay, well, you have to kind of bear the brunt of these arguments or the consequences of these arguments, because they may actually happen. And it's not all teddy bears and hugs and kisses.
Titan is such an ass.
That come along with it.
Titan is such an ass. Don't look at the live chat, please. Don't. Quote, "Comrade is entering will be beneficial to the movement." Thanks, Titan. Thanks. He's bearing his soul. Titan is just so like, okay, all right. So I think I told you this, and this is I have a hard time admitting this because it seems so contrary to, well, for people who know me, they'll be like, yeah, that's Nick. It seems so contrary to my beliefs and how I what I argue. But I've been against the 14th Amendment. I am against most sort of equal rights kinds of amendments, and the reason is because I think they're offensive. And I don't think they're offensive because, like, hey, why should a woman have a separate? Because that's the argument a lot of guys make, right? Is well, women shouldn't be listed as a separate, and it's like, no, that's not why. It's because, in my view, these rights are actually already all guaranteed to women, and they weren't to the original founding fathers when they did that. But I was like, it's so patently obvious to me that all Americans, it's these are rights to American citizens. Women are American citizens. Gay men are American citizens. So the second you even grant that they need extra protection, you have granted at least a part of the argument that's being used to undermine that, which is that they're somehow different. No, they're citizens, they're already protected, and any argument that they're not, and even suggesting you need a law that protects them admits that they're different. No, they're already protected. So I especially coming out of high school, I was really against the 14th Amendment because I was like, I think it undermines the best of the arguments as to why we're all the same. And I remember, because I find these things fascinating on an intellectual level, I like arguments. I like understanding how they process. I remember making this argument to my wife once, and she broke down in tears. She was mortified, and I stand by my argument. I think it's a good argument. But the fact that I could be against this amendment that would guarantee her right to vote and all of these other things, and I believe I'm correct. Her right to vote is, in fact, I know I'm correct. Her right to vote is already enshrined. But it's easy for me as the guy to sit there and say, well, this Constitution already grants that, and it's this perfect. It does, but it's not recognized. And it hasn't been. And rolling it back has these consequences and not admitting that it's human beings who are looking at this, and biased human beings that unfortunately have to be fucking told, because sometimes we act like children. We have to be told, you grab a stick and, hey, Sparky, women are fucking human beings too. It's like we shouldn't have to, but I'm not in charge of what we should or shouldn't have to do. We have to do it. We have to sit there and say, okay, because human beings are idiots, gays have the same rights. I don't know why you have to say this, but they do. So do women. It's like, I guess we have to enumerate it, because if we don't, some idiot is going to come into power and question it. So I never made the argument again, and I moved on to other things. But for me, I still believe in my argument. I still think I'm right on that. But it's this ideal that is not how it's practiced in reality. And if I try to argue for my ideal, I'm going to do a lot of fucking damage, because the reality is we do have to tell some people that, we're human beings first, and race, gender, all that shit, like a distant second, fifth, 100th, it's not even... I wish you didn't have to tell people that, but you do. So my idealism about this is so much more damaging than it is. So I've never made the argument again. Except, I guess, just now for all to hear. Yeah,
because that won't be taken out of context.
Yeah, Sinister just said that. Sinister just said, "I'm sure you're coming out against the 14th Amendment," and that's why this is a little bit of a different show. This is a little bit on. That's why somebody's gonna. What can you do? But
yeah, I mean, that's like one of the things I can come out and say. Look, I was dismissive of a lot of the arguments against things like overturning Roe versus Wade, specifically because I had the luxury of not thinking that they were actually that it was a consequence that would actually be faced. So I could stand high on my moral high horse and beat that thing to death, and then keep beating it. I have the moral high ground here. This is badly reasoned. It should absolutely be overturned, and then we can either pass a constitutional amendment, or we can look at the 9th Amendment and say, look, the right to bodily autonomy clearly exists in the because this is a strong historical right to bodily autonomy. Has strong historical context. Like it clearly falls under the 9th Amendment. Like, let's make the right argument and bring the case up before and get it decided on a good, solid, strong basis that nobody's going to be able to walk around and just hit one linchpin and the whole thing comes crumbling down. And I could do that so easily because, it doesn't really matter.
It was an intellectual exercise. It was an intellectual exercise, is what it was. And now
that it isn't anymore, I'm like, well, consequentialism versus principalism or principles, whatever that other one is. It's like which, because I have such a hard time between those two. And you mentioned when I talked to you originally, it's like, well, you're pretty much a consequentialist
across the board,
because the consequences of the consequences of not following these principles is it's still a consequence. And I'm like, because I do believe that consequences, you can't just dismiss consequences. They're real and they affect people. And if they're real enough and they affect enough people, they can cause a hell of a change. I always try to be very careful when I start talking about like things like civil war, because there's a huge difference between like a populist uprising versus a civil war. Civil wars where some state or groups of states decide they're going to, violently take on the federal government, versus a popular uprising where the states themselves aren't necessarily involved, but the population is. They start, kind of like what we saw over 2020 with the Black Lives Matter movement. Some elements of that got pretty violent. That's not Civil War territory. Even if it were to spread to be mostly violent, that's not Civil War territory. That's popular uprising. There's a big difference between the two, and I think popular uprising is more likely. Although with things like overturning Roe versus Wade, we are starting to see states outright deny federal authority, and that's like the second to last step to an actual civil war. So there's consequences and they matter. And now I'm like, I don't know how we untangle this, because the consequences of untangling it seem to risk a collapse of, a societal collapse, or at least a collapse of the rule of law. But not following it, we may struggle along a little bit farther. But ultimately, if we keep going this way, there's still going to be a collapse of the rule of law. Because we'll have broken out all of the fundamentals for all law, and nobody will pay attention to it. They'll make laws based off of whatever their whim is, and then they'll follow it or not, as we saw clearly with many of the state officials violating their own COVID policies and jet setting off places so that they didn't have to be subject to the very rules that they passed for their own states.
Yeah.
It's like, all these roads lead to this rubble at the bottom of this cliff. And it's like, I don't know how we do the actual U-turn to go away from that cliff. It's like, okay, well, we can take this road, which is a little bit shorter and just kind of runs straight out of the cliff, or we can take this one and it's a more oblique road, but it still goes off the end of the cliff. We'll just make it a little bit longer. Well, it's not my problem. I probably won't be around for it,
I do want to talk about...
Great idea dumping it on your kids, but...
I do want to, because I think there's some interesting. This is why this is a really great. I wanted to do this show. You had said we should do this like for the night we come back, and it's like I'm still jet lagged. I still have some COVID brain, which has been acting up probably as a result of the jet lag. So I was just like, I wanted a day or two to try to sort myself, because there's so much to unpack in all of this, and I want to unpack a little on ethics, a little on other things. But I guess the biggest that just sort of hit me on this. I used to, as a kid, ask my dad all the time. My dad was a criminal defense attorney. He actually did all kinds of law. He did real estate for a while. He was a general practitioner, but he ended up spending a good deal of time criminal defense. And even it was in Massachusetts, you have to be certified to do murder one cases, which he was. So, but I remember asking him all the time what the law was about, and I always thought he was going to say justice, and I was always disappointed when that wasn't his answer. And he said it was about stopping violence, because that's all it's really about. And he would talk about how really the reason, justice is nice and everybody wants to see justice, but it's very hard to do. It's really hard to do, because unless everybody was there, and unless you know what everybody was thinking and you know everybody's motives, which you never do, it's very hard to talk about what justice really actually is. Everyone's got their own conception of it. So the idea is to constantly operate in the gray areas. You say, after you've had a trial, because the job of the judge is to make sure that both sides walk away unhappy. And I was like, how can that possibly be it? But the more and more I see of how A, that works, and B, how countries talk to each other and all negotiations work, I realize, okay, it sort of really is that. When we're talking to Macmillan about what's going to bring people to the table, there's this idealist approach, which is, the way that Ukraine and Russia are going to come to the table is because, well, gee, they'd rather, negotiate than fight. And he was like, no, what it really is it's when the consequences of not going to the table outweigh the consequences of going to the table. It's kind of this inverted way of looking at it. But what I realized was judges aren't really, they care about doing the right thing, and they certainly care about following the law because it's a very good guideline. But their ultimate goal is to make it so that people have a decision they can live with, where they're not going around killing each other. And that's why we have laws, so that we know what consequences are beforehand. We can have rules. When people break the rules, we say this is how we can deal with it, without everybody just going around shooting each other, without the wild, wild west, and yada, yada, yada. And by that metric, what I find interesting is I'm not comfortable with that. I'm much more comfortable with defined parameters where I know what the expectations are. And what that's saying is, no, it's okay that judges don't all agree. We're not going to get them to all agree. And I think, no, the law should be obvious. It's prescriptive. It just tells you this happens, you do this. And it's sort of like, no, and it's okay if it's constantly changing. It's okay if we don't understand what it is. And my suspicion is, if he were here and we were talking to him about the Constitution, he'd say, it's okay that we're ignoring the Constitution. It's actually okay, and the Founding Fathers were smart enough. They should have realized, and probably did, that we'd eventually get to a point very similar to where we are now. And the reason is because that's kind of what progress is, and the laws will never be able to keep up with it. The laws will never be able to keep up with change. So the question is twofold. is whatever system we have now, which is not the same system we're going to have in 10 years or 20, or because it's just constantly evolving. It's essentially a living organism. Is it now better than what we had 10, 20, 30 years ago? Meaning more people have more rights, more people have more free time, more people have, and it is sustainable, which is a biggie. We're not just abandoning everything. Are we hitting those things correctly? Is it probable we'll continue to do that and continue to head in the right direction? And if that's the case, then does it matter that we're following the Constitution? Does it matter that we're following the laws? It will matter if we hit a critical mass, if we hit a tipping point, enough people say we're not doing this right, that it starts a war. But as long as that's not where we are, how much does it matter?
I would say that it doesn't, at least up till 2020, I would agree with you, that we've more or less, standard of livings have more or less risen. Where all of our metrics, generally speaking, have been going up, not quite as fast as they used to. They're kind of plateauing a little bit. But the thing that I keep pointing out, and this is one of the issues I have with the moral hazard of our fiscal policy, is that it's a moral hazard. Yeah. And it's not mathematically sustainable. It's working now.
Well, let's keep fiscal policy out of it. I think you're with fiscal policy. I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a different issue, though. But I agree with you.
But it's like the housing market. It was working just fine all the way up till 2007. It worked until it no longer worked.
Okay, that's a fair point.
The thing of it is it sustainable? And I would argue that it's not. If you're going to deviate from this set of prescribed laws that that the whole union had said, okay, this is our fundamental founding document, this is the highest law of the land, and it might work for a while, and that while could be a very long while. I'm not saying it isn't a long while, but at some point, it will stop working. Then when we need that backbone there to fall back on, to be able to say, no, this is the law, this is how things are done, then it will stop working, and you're going to end up with a collapse again, because it will have become so neutered that somebody's finally going to just say, I don't give a shit what it says at all, and I'm going to be president for life, and I'm going to use the military to, we don't want that.
But okay, so therein is the same problem, though, which is even if we went back to that, we'd end up back where we are now, because we still find the cracks. And even though you have that ideology, and I think that's something I've come to appreciate in conservative ideology, the problem is if you can't get 90% of the population to agree in perpetuity to keep acting that way and to keep doing that, we're going to end up exactly where we are now. While you're right.
Hopefully we can actually learn from this experience, but with the passage of time, people become complacent. People, generations become more complacent, and they forget the lessons of the previous generations because it didn't affect them. So that is always going to be a problem. And I don't know that there's a solution for it.
Well,
I don't know that there is.
Well, I've got one for you. You're going to hate it. It's stupid. It's trite. Faith is the closest answer I can come up with, which is to say that, okay, we are where we are now. Every system eventually fails. Every single system eventually fails. So trying to come up with a system that's going to last forever isn't going to work. The best you can do is put one foot in front of the other and have as much faith as you can that if enough people do that, you can keep the ship afloat and as good for as many people as possible for as long as possible, and hope that the next generation, hope you're successful and hope the next generation is, and the next generation after that, which is kind of what you're trying to do. But the problem is, I think you can't do it on a rigid, because we do find the cracks and we do brinksmanship and we can do things to eliminate that. But the problem strikes me as so much more, where we are now, not so much the ideal. But that's the whole discussion, isn't it? Which is the consequences or the practicality versus it's an intractable problem. Yeah, what were you going to say? Sorry.
Yeah, and I am edging ever closer to that belief. Like I'm already leaning in that direction as it is. Like I've said many times, we know where this road goes. So I'm not entirely convinced that just going back to constraining the federal government both fiscally and policy-wise, to what we had say in 1898, that's going to solve our problem, because we'll fast forward 100 years from now, assuming that we haven't all died of heat stroke because the planet burned up. We're going to be back in the same boat. So I am kind of, the more I dig into this, the more I'm leaning towards, all these systems will eventually fail because we have a generational problem. And once you start, people forget that we have things in place for reasons because they didn't suffer the consequences of those reasons. So they forget about them. They don't become important. They're out of sight, out of mind, or they're downplayed, and things end up slowly kind of falling apart. It's kind of like that whole cycle of a little bit sexist, but hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create bad times.
It's generations theory, actually.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, kind of. Yeah. So
in my view,
and it's got a good point. So I'm not, I'm kind of edging more towards, I'm not sure that I at this point it's like, okay, let's just try and move forward with trying to prevent the greatest harm to people and recognize that the republic is eventually going to fail and collapse, and we don't know what that's going to look like. But if we focus more on let's reduce the amount of harm to the greatest number of people, which is a kind of a scary and dangerous thing to tread. That's a dangerous path to tread, because I am an individualist. I do believe that the individual is a sovereign individual. Well, that makes me sound like a sovereign citizen.
Yeah, I know. The rights of the
individual shouldn't be subordinate to the welfare of the masses.
Yeah.
Because that way lies.
Which is why you're pro-choice. That's why you're pro-choice.
Yes.
I mean, if the reality is, if you believed anything else, especially if a woman has one child, or is pregnant with one child, for lack of a better word, will I don't want to get dragged into the argument on the language there, but then you'd have an issue. But let's say a woman has twins or triplets. If you're planning on aborting them, but by a utilitarian math, at least if you grant that they are human beings and or have rights, well, it's 3-1, right? So, yeah, maybe she should have autonomy, but would you save 3 lives for the... So, the only reason none of those arguments work is on the grounds that you just said, which is the sovereign individual, right? So, is that accurate, you think?
Yeah. You can't subordinate the rights of an individual for the advancement or the good of the greater population, because that way lies tyranny. We've tried that time and time again. 20th century alone, hundreds of millions of bodies, based off of trying to at least ostensibly walk that line. So I don't like subordinating the individual to the group. I think that it's incredibly dangerous to do that. So you have to be careful when you're like, okay, well, we're going to try and reduce the harm to the greatest number of people. It's a shady path to walk, because it can be abused very quickly, and abused in horrible, terrible ways. So, and then support the Second Amendment, because when it all falls apart, you're going to want to have something to defend yourself from roving gangs.
Which is a fair point. I did say this, and I said this half tongue-in-cheek, but there was truth to it, which was, it's funny. We both laughed. We both laughed because it was funny. We both laughed because it was true. When we were talking about what would happen if an EMP, wiped out or, whatever happened. And I'm sitting there going, I don't need a gun. I've got his Android. It's just like, which is basically saying the reason I don't need a gun is because I've got somebody else who's, speaking of, moral positions where I could take the moral high ground on the Second Amendment because I'm like, is Andering? There's a revolution. Yeah, I'm sorry.
You're in a very good company because, most of your politicians, most of your celebrities, most of your high profile people all make that anti-Second Amendment argument. It's like I can't help but notice you're surrounded by people with guns.
They got bodyguards. Right. They still got bodyguards. Yeah.
Yeah, because you're surrounded by people that are protecting you with guns. So It's like dismiss all of your security or disarm all of your security, and then let's neuter the secret police, Secret Service. I'm sorry.
You want to neuter the Secret Service? Right. Wait, you want to neuter the Secret Service? Did you just welcome in time,
remove
folks?
All of their firearms. Remove all their firearms. Yeah. Then you can stand up there and tell me how evil guns are. But don't you dare lecture me on gun ownership in the United States while surrounded by 50 people with guns. Sorry, that's a hypocritical position to take. And
I wanted to also point out you had got me hooked on some of the First Amendment auditing and a bunch of other things, and it's interesting because I do I've had a reasonably sheltered life, so I don't see how much of a problem there really is, and I'd like to, in time we try to do segments and we try to go, and that's one that we haven't actually gotten into that you and I have talked about before is like the First Amendment auditing and what officers do that we're not aware of, and we've got some people who have been supporters of the show who've talked about that too, and there's a lot. There's a lot more to that than I think a lot of us, probably especially liberals in many ways, don't understand because they're not as subjected to for X, Y, or Z reason. But one of the ones that I thought was interesting, and now with the body cams, with the cameras, we're seeing so much more of it. I had seen in New York, and this was an example. So I want to get into ethics really quickly. I'm not a deontologist. At least I keep saying that. I'm starting to wonder if I really am, which is to say I don't believe that you should just have these rules and you just follow the rules because life is never as simple as a rule book. But I absolutely believe in rules much more than most people. And the reason is because you don't know the consequences. This is one of the reasons why social media is when you sit there and you attack somebody on social media, you don't attack the argument, you attack the person. To them, it's just a keyboard and a screen. You have no idea what the consequences are in this person's life. You don't know whether they're having a great day, whether they're on the verge of they're completely untethered. You've got no fucking idea. And so all this horrific vitriol that we see. So this cop in this video, and we've got the video. I'd like to do a show on it, but it's just a fucking challenge. The cop had pulled over a couple of black guys, and he was very suspicious of them, and he felt that they were acting suspiciously. However, because they have rights, he was not able to hold them past a certain period of time unless he had something, and he did not have enough time to check the car. He wanted to do a more thorough inspection. He just didn't have the time. He felt if he could just get them in jail just for a small period of time, he could finish his investigation because his instincts told him, his cop following his gut, something was wrong here. He just didn't know what it was. So he turns off his camera, takes weed, which he had on. You also have to realize he had this on him, which means he was prepared to plant evidence. This wasn't. This was something. He takes the weed. He palmed it. Puts his hand right over the cup holder as he's reaching for something else, so that he can drop it in a single motion. And if you're a magician, it's like that was beautifully done. So he's looking for something else, but he drops it. Goes back, he's like, oh, there's weed here. And before he does that, he turns his camera back on. So he's got the camera off, he goes, he plants the weed, turns the camera back on, then reaches back, oh, I just found weed. What he didn't know is that there's a 10-second lag on the cameras, and that there's a buffer, and when you turn it on, there's no audio, but the last 10 seconds of video is still recorded. So when you turn the camera off, it's actually still recording. It's just only recording into the buffer that's 10 seconds. When you turn it back on again, the last 10 seconds is saved. So the 10 seconds from before you put the camera back on is still saved. So you see him planting it, then turning the camera on, sound kicks on, he's like, oh, what's this? And he literally just planted it. Now, why did he do it? He did it because he was so sure that these guys were bad, that he just needed that time. So on one level, I do kind of get it, right? And the reality is it was marijuana in New York. Now, this is while it was still illegal, but this was also something that they weren't really going to get prosecuted for. So his thinking is they go to jail, they'll be out by tomorrow, worst case scenario, and we can check everything out. And if they're clean, no harm, no foul, they lost a day. Except one of them was on probation for a previous drug issue. So now this guy who maybe he was going to turn into a career felon, it's possible, or maybe he was turning his life around, maybe a brush with law, and now he's turning his life around, and now that's completely ruined, or maybe he's somewhere in the middle. Who the fuck knows, because we're human beings. But at any rate, he was on probation, and now because the cop planted this evidence on him, he's in jail for 5 years on planted evidence. And the way he got out wasn't by, and there's this huge thing, them trying to get this footage. They found out this footage existed. The New York police were fighting them tooth and nail on releasing this footage. But the way he got out wasn't by being found innocent of that charge. It turns out the first charge that he was on probation for was also planted. And he was able to prove that one. Once that was done, he was no longer on probation. He shouldn't have been on probation when the second cop planted the evidence on him, so he shouldn't have gone to jail for that one either. At least he should have been let go because he didn't violate his probation. He had evidence planted on him falsely twice, and it cost him 5 years of his life, and it could have cost him a lot more if it hadn't been for that camera. None of those cops knew that. They didn't think about that. They didn't think about the consequences. And it was the ends justify the means. I know they're up to something. But when you take racism, when you take our biases, when you take all these other, that's why these fucking laws exist, and that's why they have to be followed. So while I'm not a deontologist, every time you break the fucking rules, you think you're justified. If you didn't, you wouldn't do it. We're all good people in our own eyes. This is the talented Mr. Ripley. No matter what you've done, you always think you're a good person, and every murderer in prison will tell you, you'd have done it if you'd have been there. It's a real problem. And I don't know. It's a very long way to get around to what you're talking about, which is the rules really do fucking matter. And that's why. And it's obviously a bad cop. I don't think he did it because he said, I want to send this asshole to jail. I really think he did it because he was dead sure this guy was guilty of something and he just needed time. When the time didn't show anything up, he's like, oh, no worry, no harm, no foul. Except he doesn't know the circumstances of this guy's life. And planting a small amount of marijuana in a time when marijuana is not considered all that serious, under normal circumstances, may not have put somebody in jail for 5 years. It did for this guy. He had no way of knowing that, but that's why it matters. Anyways, yeah. Someone remind me not to have Nick read bedtime stories. Yeah.
Okay, so too. I wasn't gonna say anything about it, but you should get the master class on storytelling. It's available on Audible. Or it's available online. You can actually watch the lectures.
This is when we were talking about. I know you want to say something. We were talking about verbal processing, and the other thing I realized is I talk in stories, which I didn't realize was a thing. But I realized if you ask me a question, what you will notice is I tend to start answering by telling a story. We started talking about this. I said my father was in law. He was a criminal. That's how I started to answer the question. It's like I tell, and it's funny because it just, to me, it seems natural. And most people are like, either they get bored by it, they think it's evasive, or whatever. And it's just like, that's just how I think in narratives. But anyways, I'm sorry, what?
Your brain just never developed past childhood. Because that's how we teach children. That's your story.
That's how.
So.
I'm an educator, and I've always been a storyteller. I've been a storyteller my entire life, and so that's how I answer anything. Hey, you were going to say something.
Storytellers are good. Storytellers are generally end up being good teachers too. There's other things that are incumbent upon that. I don't care how good of a storyteller you are. If you are a pedophile that acts on your urges, you are never going to be a good grade school teacher.
You don't even have to go that far. You could be a great storyteller, and if you're in science class saying, okay, students, let me tell you the story of Abraham, and let me tell you how the earth was created in 6,000 years, or, so storytelling's not the only requisite, but it does help. Anyways, I'm sorry, what were you going to say? Yeah, Rez, I see what you did there, Rez. Down, boy. All right, anyways, I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
I don't remember now. It's kind of having these taking responsibility for the consequences of the actions you wish to see happen. And of course, most people just dismiss it. Well, it's not my fault. Except, you supported it, so you also have to support these consequences as well. Like I supported overturning Roe versus Wade, and now it's like I have to accept these consequences, and it makes me feel kind of like a shitty person. I still think that the fundamental principle is true and accurate, but it left me in this quandary of I don't know how to deal with this. It's like how do I square the circle of being okay with these consequences in order to get back to a principled position? And I keep coming back to we shouldn't have been in this position to begin with, but it seems like it's throughout history it's showed us that it is inevitable.
And even if we shouldn't have been, we are now, so that doesn't really address the...
Exactly, it doesn't help us now.
Yeah. Well,
I'm probably still going to struggle with it, too, because there's still some other things, that it's like, okay, well, how are we going to solve our inflation problem? Okay, well, we need to jack interest rates up a hell of a lot more than we are now. And it's like, okay, that's going to cause a hell of a lot of pain to a lot of people, because you're going to send the country absolutely into recession, probably a depression. It's like, and what are you going to do to the federal government when you raise interest rates above 10% with the $22 trillion debt that they have? Servicing the debt just became like 80% of the budget. It's like there's a lot of problems involved with that. There's going to be a lot of consequences. And it's like, well, what do we do? Like people are hurting either way, which is the least harmful? Dealing with 10% inflation or of the official 10% inflation? I think that the more likely around 16 to 18%.
We've talked about that,
yeah. But or sending risking the country into an actual depression, making our federal government insolvent, possibly causing a dollar crisis, or a sovereign debt crisis. It's like, well, which one's going to be more? Well, which is the softer landing? This plane is going down, man. It's just a matter of we flying it into the cliff, or are we going to try and pull a Sully?
Oh, okay. Doorknob head. It's not just me. It's him too. Nighttime Stories brought to you by In Time and Off Time. Thank you for joining us. We hope you sleep tight. The world is coming to an end. The U.S. is burning up in flames. But thank you.
I would like to say.
Yes.
I would like to say that my story lasted approximately 7.8 seconds, whereas we suffered 7.8 minutes of your story.
Oh, fair. Wow, now I'm suddenly feeling bad.
We did warn people. We did warn people that there could be some repetitiveness, some long meandering paths to try and get to some sort of answer, because half of this is trying to figure out a position, trying to figure out what is likely true, and it's a verbal process to go through, and so it can be very, very. I really like what you said. 𝗲𝗲 had said, people are messy, and that's absolutely true. It's like not only are we messy, but it's so incomprehensibly complicated too. It's like we don't know more than we know.
Well, and so much of this is guesswork. I mean, you said several times, or risk, and that's the thing. It's like, okay, how do we know what the risk is that the U.S. economy is going to collapse? How do we know what the risk is and you've got modern monetary theorists who are sitting there going there is no risk at all. And I'm just like, okay, that really can't be true. But these are economists, and they're sitting there saying, you can just print as much money as you like. It's like, no, I'm really quite sure you can't. And this isn't a complete layman's not sure. I mean, I actually have some idea as to why that is. And no, that's true. And
actually, it is possible. You can absolutely do that. Just like you can jump out of an airplane without a parachute. You can absolutely do that, but not for very long.
Not fair.
And
fair.
Usually only once.
Usually only once. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yes. Okay. So to be accurate, you can print as much money as you like. What the modern monetary policy theorists say is you can print as much as you like without consequence, which flies in the face of just about everything that. Okay. That was well done. Okay, I see what you did there. Yep. So all right. So yeah. But here's the thing, right? Which is, how can you prove they're wrong? Well, you really can't. You can demonstrate it's highly unlikely, but here's a group of people who are well educated. It's not like they don't understand economics, but they're saying something that seems, and I've seen no evidence that it's not. I've gotten into arguments with professors of this shit, and I'm like, they haven't been able to. That's another story. But at any rate, yeah. So it's like there's so many. The only conclusion I can reach is life is unfortunately a struggle, and trying to answer these questions is a struggle, and there's no answer that's going to last you for an extended period of time. You have an answer that'll last you a short period of time until you get new information, and sometimes that new information is that you yourself were biased, you weren't paying attention, whatever. So it's the only people I find I don't really like or trust in life are the ones who are really sure of themselves. The ones who are sitting there saying like, oh, the answer's this. The answer's, no, it's utilitarianism is the ethical system. That's what it is. Well, the way to solve, liberal policies are always correct, conservative policies are always correct, or they're always incorrect. It's the ones that are really sure of any particular position that I really start to distrust, because the older I get, the more sure. The only thing I'm sure of is how little I know and how much I'm unsure of, and it ends up just being this god awful process of reevaluating, which is what it sounds to me like you really wanted to do here. Why you wanted to do it live in front of an audience of 100 million people, I don't know. But then again, I may have slightly inflated our live stream audience, but
only by about 6 zeros.
Only by about 6 things. Oh, dear
6 zeros. I mean, is 6 zeros really any different than 1 0? I mean, come on.
Exactly. Well, that's why I say 6. That's why I think I could say. I'll write a paper on 6 equals 6 million. Oh dear Lord. Well,
yeah,
no,
it's one of those. It's just we're trying to work through things. I guess maybe it's helpful maybe to see how you arrive at some of the things that you believe, or some of the arguments that you're making. How did you get there? Because I've had people where I've made an argument about something, and it's like I just don't even see how you can get there. How do you get there with that? And that's like, because I spend hours alone inside of a truck, listening to lots of different podcasts, different books, whatever happens to strike my fancy, news, current events, etc. And it's like, I actually kind of pride myself a little bit on the fact that I'm specifically avoiding echo chambers. And go from Pod Save America to Ben Shapiro in the same freaking 2 hours. So it's like I'm trying to get the widest breadth of input about a lot of these things as I possibly can, and then that I have lots of time. There's been times I've had to pause a podcast because somebody made an argument where I'm like, something isn't right about this. I don't know what. I can't point to anything. I just feel something's wrong with this argument. I can't articulate it. Now I've got to figure out why. Is it just that I don't like it? It's like, I don't like your arguments that look at all the other goddamn industrialized first world nations in my country. They don't have nearly the same kinds of freaking gun violence issues the United States have. And what do all they have in common? They've all significantly restricted gun ownership. You're right. I don't have a response for that because it's true, and I don't know why. And I don't think anybody else knows why either. They're showing correlation, but I don't think any of them has been able to at least convince me of actual causation. So it's like I'm not sure why, because the problem is hugely complicated, especially when you consider that most of those countries that we're comparing ourselves to don't have just a fraction of the population we have. Like, come on, we have like 335 million people in this country by this point. You know, because remember, we're getting about 2.1 million new people a year coming across our border right at this point. So we got to be close to 335 million at this point. You know, look at how many people does England have? 32 million.
So, shoot! Now I'm sorry, I lost the COVID brain kicked in. I'm sitting there going, it was funny. Yeah. We were trying to set a time for this, and I was like, I wanted to do it sooner rather than later. There are a number of good reasons to do it later, but I was just like, this is going to be a difficult show, not because it's unpleasant by any means, but it's like we're asking a lot of difficult questions and answers. But I wanted to. That's one of the reasons, and you and I have talked about this before, and I really hate it when when conservatives say, if an American says, okay, this is my objection, we don't have health care, and I'd say, well, okay, then you're un-American because health care isn't in the Constitution. You want something that's not in the Constitution. It's get out, go find out that you're un-American. And when the left says, well, gee, you voted for Trump, you must be racist. I've certainly met plenty of racists and people who or was it for Trump or was it I don't remember, but at any rate, but that's not. There are people who aren't racist who voted for Trump. There's quite a good number of them for whatever their reasons were. That kind of discussion makes it impossible for somebody who did vote for Trump to come out and say, you know what, I did vote for Trump and here's why. And it took me a very long time before I realized that one of the biggest reasons that he won was just because he pissed off liberals. That's it. That's not a good reason. I'm not sure it's much of a better reason than doing it because you're racist, quite frankly. But the number of conservatives who really did feel like Obama, and it gets back to that Obamacare when, and John Boehner was sitting there going, hell no, you can't. Hell no, you can't. And I don't think Boehner really gave that much of a shit about healthcare and that it was getting passed over his objections. But he knew how to play to his audience, and that was what his audience was feeling, and that's what they were thinking. And, so I think Trump was, to many of them, this day of reckoning for how they felt that liberals had passed this through and gotten it done. And, but you're not going to understand that, and you're not going to, and that, I'm not saying that's better or worse than if it had been racist, but it's a different reason, and it's one that needs to be understood because, as you said earlier, consequences. So, I'm not a fan of calling people stupid. I'm not a fan of calling people racist or anti-America or unpatriotic, and that language has been difficult to watch, and it's difficult when it comes out of my side too, because I take it what safe spaces originally were. What was meant by the term safe space?
It was if my understanding is correctly, it's been a while since people were crying about safe spaces. So many other things have flooded my brain, but it was supposed to be a safe place for discourse.
The safe space wasn't to protect people from others. The idea wasn't a space where you could go and you didn't have to hear certain ideas. It was the opposite. It was a place where you could go and you could say anything in a safe environment. You weren't going to be judged for it. You'd be able to process. You'd be able to talk. And I do think I like that line. I'd heard that line. I do like that line. In order to talk, you have to risk offending people. I think that's true. And I think if you make yes, thank you. Well, yeah, you have to. Thank you. Yeah, or you have to talk, and or that will offend people. Yep. So, I think that's true, and I think we've become so hypersensitive to offense that it makes having and so easy to clip. So much of this show can be clipped for each of us. It's just become I think that's one of the biggest problems facing this country. I don't think it's the biggest, but the idea that we really can't have conversation anymore. The second you say something that somebody doesn't want to hear, you have 3 million people coming down on your ass saying, this is why you're racist. This is why you're X, Y, or Z. And it's been my experience most of the time that's not true. Sometimes it is, but most of the time it's not. And even if it is, you're not going to get anywhere telling people that and shouting them down. You get there by discourse. Most people want to be good. People want to be good, with rare exception. There's psychopaths and sociopaths. Most people want to be good. They may define it differently. It may be hard coming to terms with what good is. And that's why we have denial, right? It's like, well, I had to murder them. I didn't murder them because I was a bad person. I murdered them because they deserved it. Here's why. So, sometimes if you can't be good, you'll just find ways to redefine good to cover whatever your dumbass did. But that notwithstanding, people want to be good. So, in general, if you can find a way to meet them there and then talk, I think you do better. That's my 2 cents.
I think that, and I think until definitively proven otherwise, that you should afford people the benefit of being genuinely a decent person.
And I mean, the other thing is, there is another side to this argument. I think it's worth considering, which is you do have to be careful because there is speech which is dangerous. There's absolutely speech which is dangerous. So I'm not a free speech absolutist either. I absolutely think, obviously, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. I think what Trump was doing, he should have absolutely known that what he was doing was getting this crowd riled up. And, I don't think you can sit there and, say that he doesn't bear responsibility for his words in that context. But the vitriol with which we have communications nowadays, especially with ideas that we don't like, I think it has some benefit, but I think long term the consequences outweigh the benefits. That's my analysis on it. Could be wrong, wouldn't be the first time, but that's what I see. I think when people aren't, and I've said this before about mass shooters. What do you say? What do most mass shooters? What are the things that they say in their manifestos? Now you'll hear me. They'll listen now.
Well. You should amend that statement to say most active shooters.
Yes. Okay. I'm not going to get into that. I'm fading. So I'm not going to get into that.
Yeah, I know you won't, because you'll lose, because we've already had this discussion.
Here we go.
That's why it's just a gentle reminder to that what you're actually talking about, active shooters, not mass shooters.
I'm active. Okay. All right. Yeah, we'll have that discussion again, I'm sure. Not tonight. I am fading. All right. Well, I think to reiterate how we started, you were feeling conflicted about all of these things. You wanted to see us returning to more of what the founding fathers had wanted, and here we were, and there were consequences to a Supreme Court that was doing just that. And there's some pretty bad consequences, and I'm scared. I'll be honest, I'm scared. I'm scared because I'm seeing things, and I've said to my daughters have come up to me and said, Daddy, what's going on? Because they're talking about it in school, which I think is awesome. I think that's great. I wouldn't have thought they'd be talking about it in school, but they are. Sometimes they're getting misinformation too, because their parents are saying, well, it's this, and this. It's like, that's not quite true. But I tell them, look, the state we live in, they're going to enshrine these rights. I'm proud of the fact that my state was the first state to recognize gay marriage. It's like, damn fucking right, that was my state.
Yeah. Well, my home state was the first state that gave women the right to vote.
And nobody cares about that, is Andrew. Okay, put your dick away. We get it.
Before you shower me with accolades for a state that did something before I was even born, I feel compelled to also point out that they did it because they didn't have enough. They didn't have enough population to actually qualify as a state, so they had to give women the right to vote. So they had enough voting population to actually become a state.
I put the shield down, but I think people can still hear you. I don't know who our producer is, but the guy's gotta get the audio fucking, because the shield is down. Him. I can still hear you. Yeah, I should. I don't know who's going to produce the show if I fire him. We're already basically bottom of the barrel.
Hey, just start using this catchphrase. Now, you're going to have to credit Bear with this. So you'll say, well, I'm going to steal Bear's line, but it's the worst production, best content.
Worst production, best content. All right. Oh, well, there you go. Hold on. Stand by one. Yeah, we're just going to, okay. There we go. Let's get that fixed. All right. Yep. All right. Well, so anyways, no, I'm glad we hadn't done an off time in a while, and I know this was bothering you. And I think everybody. We also need to do an after dark, because I think everybody. I am scared, because I told my daughters, in our state, you're going to be okay. At least for now. You never know what's going to change 50 years from now. We're going to recognize all the rights that are being rolled back, but a lot of states won't. And it's a scary time for Americans, and it's a scary time for those of us who care about these rights, of which, by the way, you are one of them. So it's we're all. I'm going to say this. I think we're all scared, and if you're not, I don't think you've been paying attention. So I'm glad we had a chance to sort of hash this out. I was under no illusions we weren't going to come up with any answers, but I think the processing is worth it.
I'm not sure how much progress we actually made to a satisfying solution to this conundrum, but it is something that has been kind of troubling me over, and I'm not going to say that because that sounds too self-aggrandizing. I think I've started this which state has the biggest dick contest, because now Sinister Porpoise, $2. Thank you, Sinister, for your support. PA gave us the Declaration and Constitution. Okay, so I was going to say, yes, the rest of the 13 original states ratified it. So technically, they're the ones that actually gave us the Constitution.
Here we go. This is on me. I apologize to our entire audience. Anyway. I apologize. This is entirely on me.
Yes, we've devolved into pedantic arguments. So.
Because that's not where we started. Tell me that's not where we started.
Well, I mean, pedantic or not, it's still important.
Yes, it is.
How do you reconcile these things? It's like I don't know what the answer is. And I'm not sure that there actually is going to be a satisfying answer to that issue. So I mean, some people don't. I guess I hate to say that. We just said we shouldn't call people racist or just stupid or whatever it is. But like some people, I don't think have really thought through a lot of this stuff, especially at my side. They're just gung ho, blah, this. Abortion is murder. End of discussion. It's like, well, you didn't put very much thought into this, did you?
Yeah, well, it's a struggle. We have limited time on this earth, and all the time that you spend trying to come up with what's the best thing you can do is time you don't spend with your family, time you don't spend with, playing video games, time you don't spend working. We all got to make a living. So you come up with the best shorthand you can for what's the answer that I'm going to do, how am I going to proceed, but the problem is it always has to be subject to further revision, and that's the part that sucks, and the people that are the most unpleasant to know or spend time with are the ones who think that their ideas aren't subject to revision, and so I think it's an important process, but it sucks, and it's a process that never really ends. You don't have enough time for it as it is, and it still isn't going to be enough. So I don't know, but I'm really glad that we decided to at least have this discussion and think about these issues. There isn't a better time for it, I think, given what's going on in this country. So thank you, Xander. I think this was
and to see how the sausage, sausage of positions and thoughts and arguments actually come about.
All right. Well, I don't know if anyone's. I should have thought of this beforehand about the. I'm gonna. If anyone wants to, I'll be in the Discord. I'm probably gonna decompress for about 10 minutes after the show. It takes me a little while to unwind all the mechanics back here, but I'll get that in. So I'll be in the Discord if anybody wants to chat more about it. So I think we just had a drop, but hopefully we can get we just had a drop of the Discord, and we'll continue sort of, I think, our regular scheduling. But thank you very much, Xandring. I appreciate it. The other thing, I'm sorry 𝗲𝗲 wasn't able to make it, but 𝗲𝗲 talks a lot about being vulnerable. And I think it's being vulnerable is always difficult to do, but I think it's how you can make progress on any number of issues. In some ways, it's also how you get your ass handed to you. That's why nobody wants to do it. But I think it took a lot of courage to come out here and be vulnerable and to have this discussion. And I think it was a good one. So thank you very much. And hopefully, thank you.
Well, hopefully, some people can maybe watch this and realize it's like, people have a lot of time to think about this. Granted, they may not be the smartest person in the room, but, they're having a difficult time trying to come up with the right answer too, and see how messy it can be, how you can believe in something and still have contradictory outcomes.
Did Maya just post, "My state gave the world me"? Is that what she really just said? I mean, I have to agree, but still, okay. Now, I'll give her that one. All right. Thank you all for joining us. I'll be in the Discord, a few minutes after the credits. Are you planning on joining, Xandring? Or it's getting kind of late, so I don't know what
pop in.
All right.
I can pop in for a few minutes. I'm going to try. I know every time I actually do pop in, I'm like, I'm going to try and keep this brief, and then I'll end up talking to somebody for 5 hours, and I'm like, okay, well, I got to start driving again in 2 hours, and I haven't slept yet, so
don't
do that.
Stay
for a little
safe,
while, and I'll try and stick to the. If there's something you really want to chat with, I'll be there for a little bit.
Brevity is not something either of us were built for. All right. Thank you all for joining us. See you in the Discord in a few minutes. Have a good night.